Sometimes a mother's love forces her to do things she never thought possible. Mary Ellen Harper stands barefoot at the gates of the richest ranch in town, swallowing her pride for the sake of her 3 hungry children. With her husband gone and winter coming, she has nothing left to offer except her willingness to work. The wealthy rancher, Silas McCrae, watches this desperate woman from his porch, seeing something in her eyes that reminds him of everything he's lost. She's not begging for handouts. She's asking for a chance to earn what her family needs to survive. When 2 broken souls meet at life's crossroads, anything can happen. What will Silas decide when faced with Mary Ellen's quiet courage? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust had settled around Mary Ellen's worn boots by the time Silas McCrae finally spoke. His voice carried the weight of a man who had grown accustomed to silence, each word measured like precious water in a drought. "Kitchen work, you said." Mary Ellen clutched her wedding ring through the thin fabric of her dress pocket, feeling the smooth gold band that had once promised her a future filled with hope. Now it served as her only connection to the man who would never return from Gettysburg, leaving her with 3 children and dreams that had withered like crops in the merciless Texas sun. "Yes, sir. I can cook, clean, mend clothing, whatever needs doing." Her voice remained steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I don't ask for charity, Mr. McCrae. Just honest work for honest pay." Silas studied her face, noting the determined set of her jaw beneath hollow cheeks that spoke of too many meals given to children instead of consumed herself. Her dress, though clean and carefully mended, had seen better years. The fabric told stories of a woman who understood the value of making things last, of stretching every resource until it could stretch no more. "Children need feeding," he said finally, not quite a question. "Tommy's 12. He can work alongside me, earn his keep. Sarah's 8, good with numbers and letters. Little Ben's only 5, but he's no trouble." Mary Ellen's words came faster now, as if speed might convince him where desperation had not. "We won't be a burden, sir. I give you my word." Behind those weathered ranch house windows, Silas kept a photograph hidden in his desk drawer. The image showed a woman with kind eyes holding a boy of perhaps 6 years, both smiling at something beyond the camera's reach. His wife Catherine and their son Daniel, taken by fever 3 winters past, when the doctor couldn't reach them through a blizzard that had trapped them all for 2 weeks. The house had been silent ever since, except for the echo of his own footsteps and the occasional conversation with his ranch hands. $50 a month, Silas said, surprising himself with the offer. "Room and board included. You start tomorrow." Mary Ellen's knees nearly buckled with relief, but she maintained her composure. "That's generous, sir. More than generous. Sunrise to sunset. No special treatment because you're a woman." His tone held no cruelty, merely the straightforward expectation of a man who valued work above all else. "Understood." As Mary Ellen walked the mile back to the small cabin she rented on the outskirts of town, her mind raced with possibilities. $50 would cover their basic needs and perhaps allow her to save toward keeping their small homestead. The land had been her husband's dream, 20 acres of possibility that he'd worked every spare hour to improve before the war called him away. The cabin held everything they owned, in 2 rooms that had seen better days. Tommy sat at the rough wooden table, practicing his letters on a slate board by candlelight. His shoulders had begun to broaden in the way that announced approaching manhood, but his eyes still held the uncertainty of a boy forced to grow up too quickly. "Mama?" Sarah looked up from where she sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching pictures in the dirt with a stick. Her artistic eye caught details others missed, and her drawings often revealed truths that words could not express. Did the rich man say yes? Little Ben tumbled across the floor, playing with carved wooden soldiers their father had made during quiet evenings before the war. The toys were among their most precious possessions now, tangible reminders of hands that would never carve again. "He did, sweetheart. We start work tomorrow at the McCrae Ranch." Mary Ellen gathered her children close, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair, drawing strength from their solid warmth. "Things are going to get better now." Tommy straightened his shoulders. "I can help, Mama. I'm strong enough to do a man's work." "I know you are, son, but you're still my boy, and boys need time to be boys." She ruffled his hair, remembering her husband's gentle hands doing the same thing. "Mr. McCrae seems like a fair man. We'll work hard and make him glad he took a chance on us." The next morning arrived with the pale promise of dawn painting the eastern horizon. Mary Ellen had risen before first light to braid Sarah's hair and ensure the children looked presentable for their first day at the ranch. Their clothes were clean but patched, their faces scrubbed until they gleamed. The McCrae Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres, with the main house standing like a monument to prosperity amid the harsh landscape. Built from local stone and timber, it spoke of permanence and wealth that Mary Ellen could barely imagine. The barns and outbuildings suggested an operation that employed dozens of men and handled hundreds of cattle. Silas met them at the kitchen door, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the small family. In daylight, Mary Ellen could see the lines around his eyes that spoke of sun and sorrow in equal measure. He was perhaps 40, with graying temples and calloused hands that indicated he worked alongside his men rather than simply giving orders. "Mrs. Harper." He nodded formally. "Children." The kitchen dominated the back of the house, with a massive cast-iron stove that could feed a crew of hungry ranch hands. Copper pots hung from hooks, their surfaces gleaming despite a layer of dust that suggested they hadn't been used for more than basic cooking in some time. A large wooden table occupied the center of the room, scarred from years of use but solid as bedrock. "Catherine used to cook for the hands during roundup," Silas said, his voice catching slightly on his wife's name. "Haven't bothered much with that since." He stopped himself, clearing his throat. "Reckon it's time to start again." Mary Ellen ran her fingers along the smooth wood of the table, sensing the history embedded in its surface. She must have been a wonderful cook. "Best biscuits in 3 counties." A ghost of a smile touched Silas's lips before disappearing. "Recipes in that book there, if you've a mind to try." He gestured toward a leather-bound cookbook that sat on a shelf near the window, its pages yellowed with age and spotted with evidence of frequent use. Mary Ellen approached it reverently, understanding that she was being offered something precious. "I'd be honored to use her recipes, Mr. McCrae." The morning passed in a blur of activity as Mary Ellen familiarized herself with the kitchen while the children explored the immediate area under strict instructions to stay close. Tommy proved invaluable in carrying water and splitting kindling, his young body adapting quickly to the physical demands. Sarah appointed herself guardian of little Ben, keeping him entertained with stories while Mary Ellen worked. By noon, Mary Ellen had managed to prepare a simple but hearty meal for the family and Silas. The aroma of fresh bread and stew filled the kitchen, bringing a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. When Silas entered for the midday meal, he paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Smells like—" He stopped himself again, but Mary Ellen understood. "Like home," she suggested gently. "Like something I'd forgotten." He took his seat at the table, where Mary Ellen had set his place with careful attention to detail. The children sat quietly, their best manners on display. As they ate in comfortable silence, Mary Ellen noticed how Silas watched her children. His gaze lingered on Tommy's earnest attempts to use proper table manners, on Sarah's artistic arrangement of food on her plate, on little Ben's unconscious mimicry of adult behavior. There was hunger in that gaze, but not for food. The afternoon brought new challenges as Mary Ellen began the massive task of cleaning a house that had been maintained but not truly cared for in years. Every surface told a story of a man who had preserved his wife's arrangements but could not bring himself to change or improve them. Dust motes danced in streams of sunlight that revealed the accumulated neglect of grief. Working methodically through each room, Mary Ellen began to understand the man who had given her family this chance. Silas McCrae was not cruel or cold by nature, but rather someone who had locked his heart away to protect it from further damage. The house itself seemed to exhale as she worked, as if grateful for attention that went beyond mere maintenance. As evening approached, the children helped prepare supper, while Silas reviewed accounts in his study. The sound of their voices, Tommy's deepening tone, Sarah's musical chatter, Ben's delighted squeals began to fill spaces that had known only silence for too long. When Silas emerged for the evening meal, he found a transformation that went beyond mere cleanliness. The kitchen glowed with warm light from properly cleaned lamps. The table was set with care and attention to beauty as well as function, and the children sat with the natural ease of a family gathering rather than the stiff formality of hired help. This is how it should be, Mary Ellen thought, as she served the meal she had prepared using Catherine's recipes and her own adaptations. This is what a home feels like. Silas ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the atmosphere that had been missing from his life for so long. When little Ben knocked over his water cup and immediately burst into tears, expecting punishment, Silas surprised everyone, looting himself by simply helping clean up the spill without a word of reproach. "Accidents happen," he told the boy gently. "No harm done." As the family prepared to return to their cabin for the night, Mary Ellen felt a cautious optimism taking root in her chest. This could work. This could be the answer to prayers she had been afraid to voice. Standing in the kitchen doorway, Silas watched them gather their few belongings. The house would be quiet again in moments, but something had shifted in the silence. It no longer felt like a tomb, but rather like a place holding its breath, waiting for life to return. "Mrs. Harper," he called as they reached the door. "Tomorrow, if you're willing, we'll discuss arrangements for the children's schooling. Can't have them falling behind in their learning." Mary Ellen's throat tightened with gratitude. "That's very kind of you, Mr. McCrae." "Just practical," he replied, but his tone suggested something deeper than mere practicality. As the small family made their way through the gathering dusk toward their cabin, none of them could know that this first day had set in motion changes that would transform all their lives. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, a pinpoint of light that seemed to whisper of hope and new beginnings. 3 weeks into their new routine, Mary Ellen had begun to believe that fortune might finally be turning in their favor. The children had settled into the rhythm of ranch life with the adaptability of youth, and even Silas seemed less burdened by the weight of his solitude. The morning sun streamed through clean windows as Mary Ellen kneaded dough for the day's bread, humming softly while Sarah helped little Ben practice his letters at the kitchen table. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the peaceful morning. Mary Ellen wiped flour from her hands and peered through the window to see a rider dismounting near the porch, not one of the ranch hands, but a stranger in a dusty coat carrying what appeared to be official papers. "Mrs. Harper?" The man's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "I have a legal notice for you." Mary Ellen's blood turned cold as she accepted the folded document, her hands trembling slightly as she broke the wax seal. The formal language swam before her eyes, but certain phrases leaped out with devastating clarity. Failure to maintain payment schedule, foreclosure proceedings, 30 days to settle outstanding debt. The amount owed seemed impossible and early, $200 in accumulated interest and penalties on the original loan her husband had taken to purchase their homestead. Money she could never hope to raise, even with her new position at the ranch. "There must be some mistake," she whispered, though her heart knew better. "My husband always made his payments." "Records show no payments received in the past 18 months, ma'am, since before his death." The courier's tone held professional sympathy, but no flexibility. "You have until the 15th of next month to settle the debt in full, or the property will be sold at auction." After the man departed, Mary Ellen stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, the notice clutched in her white-knuckled grip. The children continued their lesson at the table, unaware that their small world was crumbling around them. Through the window, she could see Silas working with one of the horses in the corral, his movements sure and confident in a way that highlighted her own desperate uncertainty. She would not burden him with this knowledge. He had already shown them more kindness than they had any right to expect. The $50 a month was generous beyond measure, but it would take 4 months of saving every penny to raise the needed sum, and they had only 30 days. "Mama," Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Is everything all right?" Mary Ellen forced her features into a semblance of calm, folding the notice and tucking it into her apron pocket where it seemed to burn against her hip. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just some business to attend to." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she could not bring herself to destroy the children's newfound sense of security. Not yet. Not until she had exhausted every possible alternative. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks, performed with mechanical precision. Mary Ellen cooked and cleaned and tended to the children's needs, while her mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios. She could try to find additional work in town, though her obligations at the ranch left little time for such pursuits. She could attempt to negotiate with the bank, though her late husband's experience suggested they would show little mercy to a widow with no collateral. As evening approached, Silas returned from his work to find supper waiting as usual, but something in Mary Ellen's demeanor caught his attention. Her movements were too precise, her smile too bright, her conversation too carefully cheerful. She reminded him of himself in the months after Catherine's death, when he had maintained the facade of normalcy while drowning in grief. "Mrs. Harper," he said quietly as she cleared the dinner plates, "is there something troubling you?" The genuine concern in his voice nearly undid her resolve. For a moment, she wavered on the edge of confession, imagining the relief of sharing this burden with someone strong enough to bear it. But pride, that fierce, stubborn pride that had sustained her through her husband's death and the subsequent months of struggle, would not allow her to become a charity case. "Just tired, Mr. McCrae. It's been a long day." He studied her face with the same careful attention he gave to evaluating livestock, seeing through her deception, but respecting her right to maintain it. "If you need anything at all, you need only ask." "Thank you. That's very kind." But they both knew she would not ask, could not ask. The knowledge hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. That night, after the children were asleep in their beds at the cabin, Mary Ellen sat at the rough wooden table and spread the foreclosure notice before her by candlelight. The numbers remained as devastating as they had been that morning, the deadline as immutable as the turning of the seasons. She could sell their few possessions, but even her mother's silver and her husband's watch would not raise more than $20. She could write to distant relatives, but none had the means to help, and most had their own struggles with the aftermath of war and economic hardship. The land itself was worth more than the debt, but only if she could find a buyer willing to pay fairly and quickly. In a depressed market with families leaving rather than arriving, such buyers were rare. More likely, the property would sell at auction for a fraction of its value, leaving her with nothing to show for her husband's dreams and labor. As the candle burned lower, Mary Ellen found herself considering options that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. She could approach other ranchers or businessmen in town, seeking employment that would pay more than her current position. Some might even be willing to advance her the money against future work, though the terms would likely be exploitative and the obligations unclear. The sound of little Ben stirring in his sleep drew her attention away from the hopeless calculations. He had begun calling Silas Mr. Papa in recent days, a title that made the rancher's eyes soften despite his attempts to maintain distance. All 3 children had begun to bloom under the stability of regular meals and the security of a roof that would not leak come winter. How could she tell them they might lose everything again? How could she explain that their brief taste of safety had been built on foundations of sand? Over the following days, Mary Ellen threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, as if perfect execution of her duties might somehow ward off the approaching disaster. She rose before dawn to prepare elaborate meals, cleaned rooms that were already spotless, and organized supplies with military precision. The children noticed her increased urgency, but attributed it to a desire to impress their new employer. Tommy began working even harder, hauling water and chopping wood with the determination of someone twice his age. Sarah created drawings to brighten the rooms they cleaned, while little Ben appointed himself the guardian of tools and supplies, carefully arranging items with serious concentration. Silas observed these changes with growing concern. Mary Ellen's laughter had become forced, her conversations stilted, and her eyes held a haunted quality that reminded him too much of his own reflection in the months after loss. Several times he approached the edge of direct inquiry, but something in her manner warned him away from trespassing on private territory. On the Saturday evening, at the end of their third week, as Mary Ellen prepared to depart for their cabin, Silas made an impulsive decision that surprised them both. "Mrs. Harper, I wonder if you and the children might join me for Sunday dinner tomorrow, here at the house." The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was prepared to acknowledge. Mary Ellen understood that he was offering something more than a meal. He was extending membership in a family unit, however temporary and uncertain. "That's very thoughtful, Mr. McCrae, but we wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition. The house gets mighty quiet on Sundays." He paused, then added more quietly, "It would be a kindness to me." Unable to refuse such a simple request, Mary Ellen nodded her agreement. "We'd be honored to join you." As they walked home through the gathering dusk, Mary Ellen clutched the foreclosure notice in her pocket and tried to imagine how she would survive, watching her children's hearts break when she finally had to tell them the truth. The dinner invitation, meant as kindness, felt like a glimpse of everything they were about to lose. 21 days remained until the auction. 21 days to find a miracle or learn to live with the consequences of her husband's forgotten obligations and her own stubborn pride. Sunday dinner at the McCrae house marked a turning point that none of them could have anticipated. Mary Ellen had spent the morning preparing a feast worthy of the occasion, using Catherine's cookbook to create dishes that filled the grand dining room with aromas of comfort and celebration. The children had dressed in their best clothes, which, though simple and well-worn, were clean and carefully pressed. Silas had made his own preparations, opening the formal dining room that had stood unused since his wife's death. Dust covers came off furniture that gleamed with the patina of quality craftsmanship, and windows were thrown open to let in fresh air and sunshine. When Mary Ellen entered carrying the first course, she stopped short at the sight of the elegant table set with fine china and crystal that caught the afternoon light like captured stars. "Mr. McCrae, this is far too grand for simple folk like us." "Nonsense. Catherine always said fine things were meant to be used, not admired." His voice carried a warmth that had been absent during their working relationship. "Besides, it's been too long since this room heard children's voices." Tommy sat straighter in his chair, conscious of the responsibility that came with being the man of his small family. At 12, he had already begun to show signs of the strong shoulders and steady gaze that would mark him as his father's son. The wooden toy soldier his father had carved sat in his pocket, a talisman he carried everywhere as a reminder of the man he aspired to become. "Sir," Tommy said carefully, "I want you to know I'm grateful for the chance to work alongside Mama. I won't let you down." Silas studied the boy's earnest face, seeing echoes of his own son's determination and courage. "A man's word is his bond, Tommy. I can see you understand that." As they shared the meal, conversation flowed more easily than any of them had expected. Sarah showed Silas her latest drawings, including a detailed sketch of the ranch house that captured not just its physical appearance, but something of its character, the way shadows fell across the porch in the afternoon. The careful arrangement of furniture that spoke of a woman's touch, the sense of permanence and prosperity that had been built through hard work and careful planning. "You have a rare gift," Silas told her, examining the drawing with genuine appreciation. "Your eye sees what others miss." Sarah beamed under the praise, her artistic confidence blooming like flowers after rain. Little Ben, not to be outdone, regaled Silas with elaborate stories about the ranch animals, assigning personalities and adventures to each creature with the boundless imagination of childhood. "The big red bull is the king of all the cows," Ben announced solemnly, "but he's a good king who makes sure everyone gets enough grass." Silas found himself smiling, actually smiling, for the first time in longer than he could remember. The sound of his own laughter surprised him, rusty from disuse but genuine in its warmth. As the afternoon wore on, Mary Ellen watched her children interact with this man who had shown them such unexpected kindness. Tommy hung on Silas's every word as he described ranch operations and cattle management, absorbing knowledge with the intensity of someone who understood that education was a precious commodity. Sarah sketched continuously, capturing moments and expressions with an artist's instinct for truth. Little Ben had somehow migrated to sit beside Silas's chair, chattering away with the easy confidence of a child who felt safe and valued. But beneath her gratitude, Mary Ellen felt the growing weight of her deception. Each smile from her children, each moment of their obvious happiness and security, made the thought of the approaching foreclosure more unbearable. How could she tell them they would have to leave this place that was beginning to feel like home? How could she watch their trust and joy crumble when the truth finally came to light? After dinner, Silas showed them through parts of the house they had not yet seen: his study with its walls of books and maps, the front parlor with its formal furniture and family portraits, the upstairs bedrooms that had stood empty for too long. In each room, Mary Ellen saw evidence of a life that had been carefully built and then frozen in time, preserved but not lived in. "This was Daniel's room," Silas said quietly as they paused before a door that had remained closed. Through the gap, they could see a child's bed, toys arranged on shelves, clothes hanging in a wardrobe, as if waiting for their owner's return. Tommy stepped forward with the respectful solemnity of someone who understood loss. "How old was he, sir?" "6. Just turned 6. Silas's voice carried the weight of all the birthdays and milestones that would never come. "He would have been about your age now, Tommy." The boy nodded gravely, instinctively understanding that some sorrows were too deep for words. "I bet he was a good son, sir." "The best." As evening approached and it came time to return to their cabin, Mary Ellen felt the cruel irony of their situation more keenly than ever. Here was a man who needed a family, children who needed a father figure, and circumstances that should have allowed them to heal each other's wounds. But her pride and her secrets stood between them like an insurmountable wall. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Tommy fell into step beside his mother, while the younger children ran ahead, their voices carrying on the evening air. "Mama," he said quietly, "I think Mr. McCrae is lonely." "What makes you say that, son?" "The way he looks at us sometimes. Like he's remembering something that makes him happy and sad at the same time." Tommy's observation showed a maturity beyond his years. "He's been good to us. If there was ever trouble, I think he'd help us." Mary Ellen's throat tightened with unshed tears. "Yes, I believe he would. But we can't depend on others to solve our problems, Tommy. We have to stand on our own." "I know, Mama, but standing on your own doesn't mean you have to stand alone, does it?" The wisdom in her son's words cut straight to the heart of her dilemma. Pride had sustained her through the worst of times, but perhaps it was also preventing her from accepting the help that could save them all. That night, as she tucked the children into their beds, each of them bubbled with excitement about their day at the ranch house. Sarah planned to draw pictures of all the rooms they had seen. Tommy wanted to ask Silas about learning to work with cattle, and little Ben had decided that he would grow up to be a rancher just like Mr. Papa. "Mama," Ben said sleepily, "are we going to live at the big house someday?" The innocent question pierced Mary Ellen's heart like a blade. "We live here, sweetheart. This is our home." "But the big house feels like home too," he insisted with the logic of childhood. "Maybe we could have 2 homes." After the children were asleep, Mary Ellen sat once again with the foreclosure notice, now creased and worn from handling. 18 days remained. 18 days to find a solution or watch her children's newfound happiness disappear like smoke on the wind. For the first time since receiving the notice, she allowed herself to consider what Tommy had suggested, that standing on her own did not necessarily mean standing alone. Perhaps there was a way to accept help without sacrificing dignity, to find a solution that preserved both her pride and her children's future. But as the candle burned lower, Courage failed her once again. Tomorrow would bring another day of maintaining the facade, another day of pretending that their world was not balanced on the edge of collapse. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch in the form of Curtis Blackwood, a man whose reputation preceded him like storm clouds on the horizon. Mary Ellen first noticed him from the kitchen window, a figure in an expensive coat, speaking with Silas near the main corral, his gestures animated and his posture suggesting someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than persuasion. Curtis Blackwood owned the largest bank in the county and held mortgages on half the failing farms between Cedar Ridge and the state line. He was a man who saw opportunity in others' misfortune, collecting properties like trophies while maintaining the facade of a respectable businessman. His thick build and carefully groomed appearance spoke of wealth accumulated through calculated ruthlessness rather than honest labor. Mary Ellen watched through the window as the conversation between the two men grew increasingly tense. Silas's posture had shifted into the rigid stance of someone barely controlling his temper, while Blackwood's gestures had become more aggressive. Though she could not hear their words, the hostility between them was unmistakable. Inside the house, Sarah sat at the kitchen table working on her latest detailed sketch of the ranch that showed not just buildings and landscapes, but the life that flowed through them. Her artistic eye had captured the essence of what made this place special. The way morning light fell across the porch where Silas drank his coffee, the chickens pecking in the yard while little Ben scattered feed, the sense of purposeful activity that marked a thriving operation. "Mama, who's that man talking to Mr. McCrae?" Sarah asked, looking up from her drawing. "He doesn't look very nice." "I don't know, sweetheart. Probably just business." But Mary Ellen's instincts told her otherwise. There was something predatory in Blackwood's manner, something that reminded her uncomfortably of the courier who had delivered her foreclosure notice. When the conversation finally ended with Blackwood riding away and Silas standing alone in the yard, the rancher's expression was darker than any storm cloud. That evening, as Mary Ellen prepared supper, Silas entered the kitchen with the heavy tread of a man carrying unwelcome news. "Mrs. Harper, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know you can speak freely." Mary Ellen's hands stilled on the bread dough she was kneading. "Of course, Mr. McCrae. Curtis Blackwood was here today, asking questions about you and your children. Specifically, he wanted to know about your financial situation and whether you had any outstanding debts." Silas's voice carried a careful neutrality that did not quite mask his concern. "I told him your affairs were none of his business, but his interest seemed more than casual." The blood drained from Mary Ellen's face as the implications sank in. Blackwood's visit could not be coincidental somehow. He had learned about her foreclosure troubles and was sniffing around like a vulture sensing carrion. "I see," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mary Ellen." The use of her first name startled them both. "If you're in some kind of trouble, I want you to know you're not alone in facing it." For a moment, the walls she had built around her pride wavered dangerously. The genuine concern in his voice, the offer of support freely given, the promise of partnership in whatever battles lay ahead, all of it called to the part of her that was tired of carrying every burden alone. "I appreciate that, Mr. McCrae, truly, but some problems are best handled by the people they belong to." Silas studied her face, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "Curtis Blackwood is not a man who involves himself in other people's business unless he stands to profit from it. Whatever he wants from you, it won't be anything good." That night, Mary Ellen's worst fears were confirmed when Blackwood himself appeared at the door of their small cabin. She had just finished tucking the children into bed when his heavy knock echoed through the thin walls. Opening the door cautiously, she found him standing in the lamplight with a smile that held no warmth. "Mrs. Harper, I believe we have some business to discuss." "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, but it's late and my children are sleeping." "Oh, I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." He pushed past her into the cabin's main room, his eyes taking inventory of their meager possessions with the calculating gaze of someone assessing value. "It concerns your upcoming foreclosure and certain options you may not have considered." Mary Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Come now, Mrs. Harper. Let's not pretend ignorance serves either of us." Blackwood settled himself uninvited in the cabin's single chair, his bulk making the furniture seem fragile and inadequate. "I'm well aware of your husband's outstanding debts and the impossible position you find yourself in. $200 is a considerable sum for a woman in your circumstances. My financial affairs are private, Mr. Blackwood." "Perhaps, but foreclosure notices become public record, and I make it my business to stay informed about such matters." His smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for comfort. "The question is, what are you prepared to do to keep your children from becoming homeless?" The threat implicit in his words made Mary Ellen's skin crawl, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm working to resolve the situation through proper channels. $50 a month from McCrae? Admirable work ethic, but hardly adequate to your needs. Even if you saved every penny, you'd need 4 months to raise the necessary funds. You have less than 3 weeks. The precision of his knowledge chilled her. Somehow, he had discovered not only her debt, but the details of her employment arrangement with Silas. The realization that she was being watched, evaluated, stalked like prey, made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "However," Blackwood continued, leaning forward with predatory interest, "I might be willing to purchase your debt from the bank. Take it off their hands, so to speak, and offer you more reasonable terms for repayment." "What kind of terms?" "Companionship, Mrs. Harper. I'm a widowed man with certain needs, and you're a woman of obvious refinement, despite your current circumstances. A few evenings a week, some social occasions, perhaps longer arrangements, as we get to know each other better." The proposition hung in the air between them like a foul smell. Mary Ellen felt bile rise in her throat as she understood exactly what he was suggesting. Her body and her children's security balanced on opposite sides of a scale she would never willingly tip. "Get out of my house." Now, don't be hasty. Think about your children, Mrs. Harper. Think about what happens to them when you have nowhere to go and no one to turn to." Blackwood rose slowly, his bulk seeming to fill the small room. "I'm offering you a solution that keeps your family together and provides security. That's more than most women in your position can hope for." "I said get out." He moved toward the door but paused with his hand on the latch. "You have until the end of the week to consider my offer, Mrs. Harper. After that, I withdraw my generosity, and you face your troubles alone." After he left, Mary Ellen sank into the chair he had vacated, her whole body trembling with rage and revulsion. The children slept peacefully in the next room, unaware that their mother had just been propositioned like a common prostitute by a man who held their future in his grasping hands. Outside, the ranch house glowed with warm light in the distance, representing everything she had begun to hope for and everything she now realized she might lose. Silas's offer of help echoed in her memory, but accepting it would mean revealing the depths of her desperation and the ugly realities that men like Blackwood brought into the world. 17 days remained until foreclosure. 17 days to find a miracle or face consequences too terrible to contemplate. The next morning brought a discovery that would change everything between Mary Ellen and Silas, though neither of them realized it at the time. While cleaning the study, Mary Ellen's cloth caught the edge of a leather-bound cookbook that had been tucked behind other volumes on the bookshelf. As it tumbled to the floor, pages fluttered open to reveal handwritten notes in the margins, personal observations about cooking for large groups, and modifications to recipes based on available ingredients and seasonal changes. Catherine McCrae's cookbook was more than a collection of recipes. It was a window into the heart of a woman who had understood that feeding people was an act of love, that gathering around a table could heal wounds and build bridges between hearts. The handwriting was delicate but confident, speaking of someone who approached cooking with both artistry and practicality. Mary Ellen found herself sitting on the study floor, reading these intimate glimpses into another woman's life. Catherine had noted which dishes were Silas's favorites, which recipes worked best for the ranch hands during roundup, and how to stretch ingredients during lean times without sacrificing flavor or nutrition. Most touching of all were the notes about Daniel, his preferences, his growth spurts that required larger portions, his delight in helping with holiday baking. She really loved them, Mary Ellen whispered to herself, understanding that she was holding evidence of a devotion that transcended death. When Silas entered the study later that afternoon to review ranch accounts, he found Mary Ellen carefully placing the cookbook back on its shelf. Their eyes met across the room, and she saw in his expression both vulnerability and a question he could not quite bring himself to ask. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly. "I was cleaning and found Catherine's cookbook. I couldn't help but notice her notes." Silas approached slowly, his hand reaching toward the book before stopping short. "I haven't looked at it since she died. Couldn't bear to." She was remarkable, wasn't she? The way she thought about food, about caring for people. Every recipe tells a story. She used to say that cooking was just another way of saying, "I love you." His voice carried a tenderness that Mary Ellen had not heard before. Even when supplies were short or the weather was bad, she found ways to make meals feel like celebrations. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both thinking about the woman whose presence still lingered in every corner of the house. Mary Ellen understood that she was being trusted with something precious. Silas's memories of happiness, carefully preserved but too painful to revisit alone. "Would you mind if I used some of her recipes?" Mary Ellen asked. Not to replace what she did, but to honor it, to keep it alive. Silas's throat worked as he struggled with emotions he had kept buried for too long. She would have liked that. She always said recipes were meant to be shared, not hoarded. That evening, Mary Ellen prepared dinner, using one of Catherine's more elaborate recipes, a beef roast, with vegetables that the handwritten notes indicated had been Daniel's favorite Sunday meal. As the aroma filled the kitchen, Silas appeared in the doorway and stood motionless, his eyes closed and his expression unreadable. "Smells just like—" He stopped himself, but Mary Ellen understood. "Like home," she finished gently. The children noticed the change in Silas during dinner. His conversation was more relaxed, his smiles more frequent, and when little Ben accidentally knocked over his milk cup, Silas simply helped clean up the mess while telling the boy about the time Daniel had spilled an entire pitcher of buttermilk during his first attempt to help with cooking. "Papa always said accidents happen when you're trying to help," Ben declared solemnly, and Mary Ellen felt her heart skip as she realized he had dropped the Mr. from his name for Silas. If Silas noticed the change, he gave no sign of objection. Instead, he listened with genuine interest as Tommy described the progress he was making with his reading, as Sarah showed him her latest sketches of ranch life, and as Ben entertained them all with elaborate stories about the ranch animals. After the children were settled for the night, Mary Ellen remained in the kitchen to finish cleaning up. She was surprised when Silas returned, settling himself at the table with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested he had something important to say. "Mary Ellen," he began, then paused as if testing the sound of her name on his lips. "I want you to know that having you and the children here has changed things for me. Changed me." She felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her eyes focused on the dish towel in her hands. "You've been very kind to us, Mr. McRae." "Silas," he corrected. "I think we're past formalities now." The intimacy of using his first name felt both natural and terrifying. "Silas, then. I've been thinking about what you said about Catherine's recipes being a way to honor what she built here. I wonder if you might be interested in taking on more responsibility. Managing the household properly, cooking for the ranch hands during busy seasons, maybe even entertaining when business requires it." The offer was generous beyond anything Mary Ellen had imagined, but it also highlighted the impossibility of her situation. How could she make long-term plans when her secret threatened to destroy everything within days? "That sounds wonderful," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure. I know it's a big change from what we originally discussed. Take time to think about it." Silas leaned back in his chair, studying her face with the careful attention he gave to evaluating livestock. "There's something else, though, something I need to say." Mary Ellen's heart hammered as she waited for him to continue. I care about you, Mary Ellen, about all of you, more than I thought I'd ever care about anyone again. His voice was quiet but steady. I'm not trying to replace your husband or take anything away from his memory, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this world. The confession hung between them like a bridge she longed to cross but dared not trust. Everything in her wanted to respond with equal honesty, to tell him that she had begun to care for him too, that her children had found in him the father figure they desperately needed, that the ranch had become more than a place of employment, it had become home. Instead, she clutched the foreclosure notice in her apron pocket and felt the weight of her deception like stones in her chest. Silas, She stopped herself before the words could tumble out. You've been very good to us, kinder than we had any right to expect. He sensed the hesitation in her response, the way she pulled back just when he expected her to step forward. But some situations are more complicated than they appear on the surface. Mary Ellen, if you're in some kind of trouble, I should get back to the children. She rose abruptly, unable to bear the concern in his eyes when she knew she was deceiving him. Thank you for the coffee, and for everything. As she walked home through the darkness, Mary Ellen felt the cruel irony of her situation more keenly than ever. Love was growing between them like spring flowers after a hard winter, but her secret stood between them like an insurmountable wall. In just over 2 weeks, everything would be revealed, and the fragile happiness they had built would crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. The weight of carrying her secret had become unbearable. Mary Ellen lay awake each night, staring at the cabin's rough wooden ceiling, while guilt gnawed at her conscience like a persistent ache. Silas's confession of care had only made her deception feel more cruel, more unfair to a man who deserved honesty from those he chose to trust. On a grey morning that matched her somber mood, Mary Ellen found herself clutching the homestead deed as she worked in the kitchen. The document represented everything her husband had dreamed, of 20 acres of possibility, a foundation for their children's future, a piece of America that would belong to the Harper family for generations to come. Now, it was nothing more than paper, worthless in the face of debts that seemed to multiply like weeds. The sound of Silas's boots on the kitchen's wooden floor interrupted her dark thoughts. He carried himself differently these days later somehow, as if the burden of solitude had begun to lift from his shoulders. The change made what she had to tell him even more difficult. Mary Ellen. He paused in the doorway, studying her expression with the careful attention she had come to know so well. You look like a woman with something weighing on her mind. The moment of truth had arrived, carried on morning air heavy with the scent of fresh coffee and her own desperate courage. Mary Ellen set down the dish towel she had been unconsciously wringing in her hands and turned to face him fully. Silas, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you weeks ago. He moved closer, his presence both comforting and intimidating. Whatever it is, we can face it together. The kindness in his voice nearly undid her resolve, but the foreclosure notice in her apron pocket reminded her that time had run out for half-truths and proud silences. With trembling hands, she withdrew the document and placed it on the table between them. I'm going to lose my homestead. The bank is foreclosing in 9 days because I can't pay the debt my husband left behind. Silas read the notice carefully, his expression growing darker with each line. When he looked up, his eyes held not judgment, but a mixture of concern and barely controlled anger. $200, he said quietly. Mary Ellen, why didn't you tell me? I could have. Because I didn't want charity, she interrupted, her voice sharp with the pain of wounded pride. Because I've been taking care of myself and my children since my husband died, and I didn't want to become just another burden for you to carry. A burden? Silas's voice rose slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. Is that what you think you are to me? To us? I think I'm a woman who's been lying to a good man about something that could destroy everything we've built here. Silas stood and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, as he stared out at the ranch that had become his life's work. When he spoke again, his voice carried the measured tone of someone thinking through a complex problem. Curtis Blackwood owns this debt, doesn't he? Mary Ellen's startled silence was answer enough. I thought so. He was asking too many questions about your situation for a man with no financial interest. Silas turned back to face her, his expression grim. What did he offer you? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire. Mary Ellen felt heat rise in her cheeks as she remembered Blackwood's proposition, the way his eyes had moved over her like she was livestock being evaluated for purchase. He suggested I might work off the debt through companionship. The change in Silas was immediate and frightening. His face darkened like a storm cloud, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, Mary Ellen glimpsed the man. He must have been in his younger days, someone capable of violence when those he cared about were threatened. "That bastard," he said quietly, the profanity shocking coming from a man who rarely raised his voice. "That absolute bastard." "Silas." "No, Mary Ellen. You need to understand something about Curtis Blackwood. He's not just a banker, he's a predator who uses other people's desperation to feed his own appetites. He's done this before, to other women in impossible situations." The revelation hit Mary Ellen like a physical blow. She had thought herself uniquely trapped, but apparently she was just the latest in a series of women Blackwood had cornered and exploited. "I won't let him touch you," Silas continued, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I'll pay off the debt myself, today if necessary." "No." Mary Ellen's response was immediate and firm. "I won't let you do that. It would make me exactly what I've been fighting, not to become dependent on your charity." "It's not charity when it's between," he stopped himself. But they both knew what he had been about to say. "Between what, Silas?" He moved closer, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Between people who care about each other. Between a man and a woman who might have a future together if they're brave enough to reach for it." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Mary Ellen felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she struggled with the implications of his words. "You don't understand the position this puts me in," she whispered. "If you pay my debt, I become beholden to you in ways that change everything between us. And if I don't pay it, Blackwood gets what he wants anyway. And you lose your land and your children's security." Silas's voice carried the frustration of a man who could see a solution but couldn't make the woman he cared about accept it. "Sometimes pride is a luxury we can't afford, Mary Ellen." Before she could respond, the sound of children's voices announced the arrival of Tommy, Sarah, and little Ben, returning from their morning chores with the ranch hands. The conversation would have to wait, but both adults knew that a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. As the children settled at the table for their morning meal, chattering about the new calf they had helped feed and the arithmetic lesson Sarah had been working on with one of the hands, Mary Ellen felt the cruel irony of their situation more keenly than ever. Here was a family in everything but name, people who had found in each other what they had all been missing. But the foundation of their happiness was built on deception and desperation, and time was running out to find a solution that would preserve both love and dignity. Silas caught her eye across the table and nodded slightly, a gesture that promised the conversation was far from over. In 9 days, one way or another, their future would be decided. The only question was whether that future would include the love that had grown between them, or the bitter ashes of dreams destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising weather that would match the emotional tempest brewing within the ranch house walls. Change was coming, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons, and all they could do was prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead. That evening, Silas retreated to his study with the grim determination of a man preparing for battle. The foreclosure notice lay spread before him on the massive oak desk, its legal language as stark and unforgiving as winter. But Silas McCrae had not built one of the largest ranches in the territory by accepting defeat when faced with seemingly impossible obstacles. He pulled out a wooden chest from beneath his desk, a repository of family documents dating back to his grandfather's original land claims. Property deeds, survey maps, correspondence with territorial officials, and legal papers that chronicled the McCrae family's gradual accumulation of what had become a ranching empire. If there was a way to help Mary Ellen that preserved her dignity while thwarting Curtis Blackwood's predatory schemes, the answer would be found in these yellowed papers. As Silas spread the documents across his desk, studying property boundaries and legal descriptions with the methodical attention of someone who understood that details mattered, a particular survey map caught his attention. The paper was older than the others, dated nearly 30 years earlier, when the territory was still being carved up into individual claims. Something about the boundary lines seemed familiar, yet wrong somehow. He cross-referenced the survey with more recent property records, tracing the evolution of land ownership through sales, inheritances, and legal transfers. What he discovered made his blood run cold with a mixture of rage and understanding that changed everything he thought he knew about Mary Ellen's situation. According to the original territorial survey, Mary Ellen's homestead, the 20 acres her husband had purchased in good faith, had originally been part of the McCrae family holdings. Not adjacent to them, but actually within the boundaries of land that Silas's grandfather had legally claimed and registered with territorial authorities. Somehow, through what appeared to be deliberate fraud, that section had been carved out and sold separately during a period when the McCrae family had been dealing with Indian raids and cattle rustling that had kept them occupied far from legal offices. The signature on the fraudulent sale belonged to Ezekiel Blackwood Curtis, Blackwood's grandfather, a man Silas remembered his own father describing as a snake who would steal pennies from a dead man's eyes. Mary Ellen's husband had unknowingly purchased stolen land. But more importantly, Mary Ellen herself now held legal claim to property that rightfully belonged to the McCrae estate property that was worth far more than the debt that threatened to destroy her. Silas leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling with the implications. The irony was staggering. The woman he had come to love, the family he wanted to protect, held legal claim to land that his family had lost through theft and corruption. If Mary Ellen pressed her case in court, she could potentially claim ownership not just of her 20 acres, but of additional land that would make her one of the wealthiest property owners in the county. But pursuing that claim would require challenging the Blackwood family's version of events, exposing decades of legal corruption, and potentially destroying the very stability that Mary Ellen sought for her children. It would also mean that Silas would have to choose between his family's legacy and the woman he loved, a choice that no amount of legal precedent could make easier. The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway announced Mary Ellen's approach. She appeared in the study doorway, a lamp in her hand and uncertainty written across her features. "Silas, I saw the light under your door. I wanted to apologize for this afternoon, for not trusting you with the truth sooner." He looked up at her, this woman who had brought light back into his life, and felt the weight of the new truth he carried. "Mary Ellen, I need to show you something. Something that changes everything." She entered the study and set her lamp on the desk, its glow illuminating the spread of documents and maps. "What is all this?" "Your homestead," Silas said carefully. "The land your husband bought, it was stolen from my family 30 years ago." Mary Ellen's face went white as the implications sank in. "What do you mean, stolen?" Silas explained what he had discovered, tracing the property lines on the old survey maps, showing her the evidence of fraud and illegal sale. With each revelation, Mary Ellen seemed to shrink further into herself, as if the weight of this new knowledge was crushing something vital within her. "So my husband bought stolen land," she whispered, "and I've been living on property that belongs to you." "No," Silas said firmly. "That's not how the law works. Your husband bought that land in good faith from someone who appeared to have legal right to sell it. You hold clear title, regardless of what happened 30 years ago. But morally, you and your children are the innocent victims of someone else's crimes. The Blackwoods stole from my family, then profited by selling stolen property to yours." Silas moved around the desk to stand closer to her. "But there's more, Mary Ellen, much more." He showed her additional documents, property assessments, and survey records that revealed the true extent of what her homestead represented. Due to water rights, mineral potential, and strategic location, her 20 acres were worth far more than anyone had realized, certainly more than enough to pay off her debt and secure her children's future. "But Curtis Blackwood knows this, doesn't he?" Mary Ellen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has to. His family has been tracking this property for decades, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim it. Your husband's death and the subsequent financial pressure gave them exactly the opening they needed." Mary Ellen sank into the chair across from Silas's desk, her face buried in her hands. "So his proposition is offer to buy my debt. Was never about helping you. It was about getting control of property that's worth 10 times what you owe, while humiliating you in the process." Silas's voice carried the controlled fury of a man who had seen too much of human greed and cruelty. "He's been planning this for months, maybe years. What happens now?" Mary Ellen looked up, her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and terror. "If I can prove the property is worth more than my debt, you could pay off the foreclosure and have enough left over to live comfortably for years. You could expand the homestead, improve the land, even hire help." Silas paused, then continued more quietly. "You wouldn't need anyone's charity or protection. You'd be truly independent." The words hung between them like a sword. Mary Ellen understood what he was, not saying that financial independence would remove the circumstances that had brought them together, that she would no longer need the shelter and security he provided, that their growing love would be tested by changed circumstances. "And your family's claim to the land?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents that proved his family had been cheated, but also recognizing that justice was more complex than simply reclaiming what had been stolen. "My grandfather is dead. My father is dead. I'm the only one left who remembers their stories about losing that land." He met her eyes across the desk. "I could fight for it in court, probably win based on the evidence, but that would mean destroying you and your children to reclaim something my family lost through no fault of yours." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that love matters more than land, Mary Ellen, that building something new matters more than reclaiming something old." His voice carried absolute certainty. "I want you to take this evidence and use it to secure your children's future. Make Curtis Blackwood pay for his family's crimes, not through revenge, but through justice." Mary Ellen felt tears threatening as she understood the magnitude of his sacrifice. He was choosing her happiness over his family's legacy, her children's security over his own rightful claim to stolen property. "Silas, I can't let you give up what belongs to you. It doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to you, legally and morally. And more than that," he moved closer, taking her hands in his own. "You belong to me just as I belong to you. That matters more than any deed or property line." Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, sending rain against the study windows like tears of relief. Inside, 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds held hands across a desk covered with documents that would change their lives forever, choosing love over law, future over past, hope over fear. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, as if the storm had washed away more than just dust and heat. Mary Ellen stood at the kitchen window, watching Silas work with the horses in the corral, while her mind grappled with the earth-shaking revelations of the previous night. In her apron pocket, she carried copies of the documents that could transform her from a desperate widow into a woman of property, and means if she had the courage to use them. The sound of approaching riders drew her attention to the main road, where she recognized the familiar figure of Judge William Harrison making his way toward the ranch house. Judge Harrison was known throughout the territory as a fair man who valued evidence over influence, a reputation that had earned him both respect and enemies among those who preferred justice to be negotiable. Silas had sent word to the judge at first light, requesting an urgent meeting to discuss matters of property law and fraud. The legal battle they were about to wage would require official sanction and judicial oversight to prevent Curtis Blackwood from using his considerable influence to suppress the truth. "Mama," Tommy said quietly, appearing at her elbow with the intuitive awareness that something momentous was unfolding. "Is everything going to be all right?" Mary Ellen looked down at her eldest son, this boy who had shouldered adult responsibilities with the quiet dignity of his father. In her hands, she held Silas's father's pocket watcher gold timepiece, engraved with the McCrae family crest that Silas had given to Tommy the night before, as a symbol of acceptance and belonging. "I hope so, son. But whatever happens, I want you to know that you've made me proud every single day since your father died." She touched his cheek gently. "You've been the man of our family when I needed you to be, but now it's time to let the adults handle things." Tommy straightened his shoulders, the watch chain catching the morning light as it hung from his vest pocket. "I understand, Mama. But if anyone tries to hurt our family, they'll have to go through me too." The fierce protectiveness in his young voice reminded Mary Ellen so powerfully of her late husband that she had to blink back tears. This boy would grow into a man worthy of the name he bore, regardless of what surname he ultimately claimed. Sarah and little Ben remained blissfully unaware of the adult dramas unfolding around them, occupied with their morning lessons and the simple pleasures of ranch life. Sarah had filled her sketchbook with drawings of their time at the McCrae Ranch, images that captured not just buildings and landscapes, but the emotional transformation of a family finding its place in the world. Judge Harrison proved to be a lean, weathered man whose sharp eyes missed nothing as Silas presented the evidence of fraud and illegal land transfers. The judge studied each document carefully, asking pointed questions about provenance and chain of custody that demonstrated his understanding of how easily legal cases could be undermined by procedural errors. "This is serious business, McCrae," the judge said finally, setting down the last of the papers. "You're alleging fraud going back 3 decades, involving some of the most prominent families in the territory. Curtis Blackwood isn't going to accept these accusations quietly." "I'm not making accusations," Silas replied calmly. "I'm presenting evidence of documented crimes and asking for legal remedies to protect an innocent woman and her children." Judge Harrison turned his attention to Mary Ellen, who had remained silent during most of the discussion. "Mrs. Harper, do you understand what pursuing this case will mean? Curtis Blackwood has considerable resources and influence. He'll fight this with everything he has, and he won't be particular about the methods he uses." Mary Ellen felt the weight of 3 generations of McCrae honor resting on her shoulders, balanced against her children's need for security and her own desire for justice. "Your Honor, I understand that powerful men don't like being challenged. But I also understand that my husband died believing he was building something for his children's future. If that future was built on stolen land, then I want the truth to come out, regardless of the cost." "And you, McCrae?" The judge's gaze shifted back to Silas. "You're giving up a potentially valuable claim to help a woman who could theoretically use this same evidence against your interests." "Mrs. Harper's interests are my interests, Your Honor. Her children's future is more important to me than any past grievances or family claims." The judge nodded slowly, recognizing the deeper currents of loyalty and affection that flowed beneath the legal technicalities. "Very well. I'll schedule a hearing for tomorrow afternoon. That should give both sides time to prepare their cases and gather witnesses. In the meantime, I strongly advise both of you to be careful. Curtis Blackwood has a reputation for playing rough when his interests are threatened." After the judge departed, Mary Ellen and Silas spent the afternoon preparing for the legal confrontation ahead. They organized documents, identified potential witnesses among the ranch hands and townspeople who might have knowledge of the Blackwood family's business practices, and discussed strategy for presenting their case in the most convincing manner possible. The children sensed the gravity of the situation without fully understanding its implications. Tommy appointed himself guardian of his younger siblings, keeping them occupied with games and stories while the adults worked. Sarah continued her sketching, but her drawings had taken on a more serious tone, portraits of the adults, with expressions that captured their determination and anxiety. As evening approached, Mary Ellen found herself alone with Silas on the front porch, watching the sun set over land that had become more precious to her than she had ever imagined possible. The silence between them was comfortable, but charged with unspoken questions about what the next day would bring. "Are you frightened?" Silas asked quietly. "Terrified," Mary Ellen admitted, "not of losing the land or the money, but of what this fight might cost all of us. Curtis Blackwood isn't a man who accepts defeat gracefully." "We'll face whatever comes together," Silas said, reaching over to take her hand in his own. "You and the children aren't alone in this anymore." The simple gesture, fingers intertwined as they sat in the gathering dusk, represented a commitment that went far beyond legal partnerships or financial arrangements. They were choosing to face the future as a family, whatever that future might hold. That night, as Mary Ellen tucked her children into their beds at the cabin, each of them had questions about the strange tension that had marked the day. She answered as honestly as she could, without burdening them with adult fears, explaining that sometimes grown-ups had to fight for what was right, even when the fight was difficult and uncertain. "Will we have to leave the ranch?" little Ben asked, his lower lip trembling with the fear of losing the only stable home he could remember. "I don't know, sweetheart. But whatever happens, we'll face it together as a family." Mary Ellen smoothed his hair back from his forehead, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood innocence. "And you'll always have people who love you, no matter where we live." Sarah looked up from her pillow with the serious expression of a child who saw more than adults sometimes realized. "Mama, Mr. McCrae loves us, doesn't he? Really loves us, like a papa would?" The question pierced Mary Ellen's heart with its simple honesty. "Yes, sweetheart, I believe he does." "Then why are you sad?" "Because sometimes loving someone means being willing to fight for them, even when the fighting is scary." After the children were asleep, Mary Ellen sat at the rough wooden table and wrote a letter to her late husband, pouring out her heart to the man who would never read her words, but whose memory still guided her choices. She told him about Silas, about the love that had grown despite her resistance, about the children's need for a father and her own need for partnership and companionship. Most importantly, she told him about the decision she had made to fight for the land he had worked so hard to provide, but also to build a new life that honored his memory while embracing the possibilities of the future. Tomorrow would bring Curtis Blackwood's wrath, legal arguments that would determine her family's fate, and the ultimate test of whether love and truth could triumph over greed and corruption. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of Silas's sacrifice and the sounds of her sleeping children, Mary Ellen felt something she had not experienced since her husband's death. The quiet confidence that came from knowing she was not facing her battles alone. The storm had passed, but the real test of their courage and commitment lay ahead in the bright, unforgiving light of day. The courthouse in Cedar Ridge had never seen such a crowd. Word of the legal confrontation between Mary Ellen Harper and Curtis Blackwood had spread through the territory like wildfire, drawing spectators who understood they were witnessing more than a simple property dispute. This was a battle between different visions of justice, one based on power and influence, the other on truth and evidence. Curtis Blackwood arrived with an entourage that included his personal attorney, a thin man with calculating eyes who specialized in finding legal loopholes for wealthy clients. Blackwood himself appeared confident to the point of arrogance, his expensive suit and gold watch chain announcing his prosperity, while his cold smile suggested he viewed the proceedings as an amusing diversion rather than a serious threat to his interests. Mary Ellen entered the courthouse with Silas at her side, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had found her courage in the darkest of circumstances. She wore her best, dressed simple but clean and well-fitted, and carried the leather portfolio containing the documents that would either secure her children's future or expose her to Blackwood's revenge. Judge Harrison called the hearing to order, with the gravity befitting a case that could set precedents for property rights throughout the territory. The original survey map lay spread across a table where both sides could examine it, its yellowed paper and faded ink serving as silent testimony to decades of hidden truth. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge began, "you hold the mortgage on Mrs. Harper's homestead and have initiated foreclosure proceedings. Present your case." Blackwood's attorney rose with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to winning through intimidation rather than evidence. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of unpaid debt. Mrs. Harper has failed to maintain the payment schedule established by her late husband, and the bank has exercised its legal right to recover the outstanding balance through foreclosure." He presented documentation showing the loan history, payment records that ended abruptly with the husband's death, and legal notices that had been properly served according to territorial law. Everything appeared straightforward and unassailable, the routine exercise of banking procedures that had been followed countless times before. "Mrs. Harper," Judge Harrison continued, "what is your response to these allegations?" Mary Ellen stood slowly, feeling the weight of everyone's attention but drawing strength from Silas's presence beside her. "Your Honor, I do not dispute that money is owed, but I believe the court should examine how this debt came to exist and whether the foreclosure proceedings are being conducted in good faith." Silas stepped forward to present the historical documents, his voice steady and clear as he explained the evidence of fraud that had been uncovered. The original territorial survey showed clearly that Mary Ellen's homestead had been carved out of the McCrae family holdings through illegal means, sold by someone who had no right to transfer the property. "This is preposterous," Blackwood's attorney interrupted. "These alleged irregularities occurred 30 years ago, far beyond any reasonable statute of limitations. Even if true, they have no bearing on Mrs. Harper's current financial obligations." But Judge Harrison was studying the survey map with the careful attention of someone who understood that property law was built on the foundation of accurate records and honest transactions. "Blackwood, did your family ever hold title to the property in question?" The question hung in the courtroom air like smoke from a dangerous fire. Blackwood's confident expression wavered slightly as he realized the direction of the judge's inquiry. "My grandfather may have been involved in some land transactions during the territorial period," he admitted carefully, "but all sales were conducted according to the legal standards of the time." "Standards that apparently included selling property you didn't own," Silas said quietly, but his words carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. Mary Ellen watched the interplay between the two men with growing understanding. This was not really about her homestead or her debt, it was about decades of accumulated grievances between families, about justice delayed but not forgotten, about the difference between legal technicalities and moral truth. Judge Harrison called for a brief recess to examine the documents more thoroughly, leaving both sides to contemplate their strategies while the courthouse buzzed with speculation. Mary Ellen found herself surrounded by well-wishers from the community ranch hands who had worked for both families, storekeepers who had witnessed the Blackwoods' business practices, and other widows who understood the vulnerability of women facing powerful men alone. Mrs. Harper, an elderly woman, approached, her gnarled hands clutching a worn shawl. "My husband worked for Curtis Blackwood's father 20 years ago. He always said the Blackwoods got rich by taking what belonged to others and making it look legal." Similar testimonies began emerging from the crowd-whispered stories of foreclosures that seemed suspicious, land deals that enriched the Blackwoods while impoverishing their neighbors, and a pattern of behavior that suggested the current case was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger scheme of exploitation. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. What had begun as a routine foreclosure hearing was evolving into something much larger, a reckoning with decades of corruption that had been hidden behind legal formalities and community intimidation. The real battle was just beginning. Judge Harrison's gavel commanded silence as he prepared to render his decision. The courthouse had grown so quiet that the scratch of his pen against paper seemed thunderous in the charged atmosphere. Mary Ellen clutched her marriage certificate to her late husband, the document that legally established her children's inheritance rights and her own claim to the disputed property. After careful examination of the evidence presented, Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of Solomon's wisdom. This court finds that Mrs. Harper's homestead was indeed carved from property illegally transferred by Ezekiel Blackwood 30 years ago. Curtis Blackwood shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage and disbelief. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. You cannot invalidate decades of legal transactions based on dusty old papers and hearsay testimony." "Sit down, Mr. Blackwood." The judge's tone brooked no argument. "The evidence clearly shows that your grandfather forged documents and bribed territorial officials to steal land from the McCrae family. Your current attempt to foreclose on Mrs. Harper appears to be part of a deliberate scheme to complete that theft through legal manipulation." The words hit Curtis Blackwood like physical blows. His carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbled as the full implications of the judge's findings became clear. Not only was he losing his claim on Mary Ellen's property, but the ruling opened the door to investigations into other suspicious land deals that could unravel much of his family's accumulated wealth. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, the court finds that Mrs. Harper's property is worth considerably more than the debt claimed against it. The water rights alone are valued at 3 times the outstanding mortgage balance. Mary Ellen felt her knees go weak with relief and shock. Not only was she free from the crushing debt that had threatened to destroy her family, but she was suddenly a woman of means, wealthy enough to secure her children's future and independent enough to make her own choices about marriage and family. Silas reached over and squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with pride and something deeper, the joy of seeing justice triumph over corruption, but also the uncertainty of a man who wondered if the woman he loved still needed him now that circumstances had changed so dramatically. "However," the judge added, and Mary Ellen's heart stopped, "there remains the question of the McCrae family's original claim to this property. Mr. McCrae, you have standing to challenge Mrs. Harper's title based on your family's historical ownership." The courtroom held its collective breath as all eyes turned to Silas. This was the moment that would define not just legal ownership, but the character of the man Mary Ellen had come to love. He could reclaim his family's stolen legacy, restore the McCrae holdings to their original boundaries, and emerge from the courthouse as one of the wealthiest landowners in the territory. Silas stood slowly, his weathered hands steady as he faced Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, I formally renounce any claim my family might have to Mrs. Harper's property. Justice has been served by exposing the truth about how it was stolen. But Mrs. Harper and her children are innocent victims who deserve security, not more upheaval." The words echoed through the courthouse like a benediction. Curtis Blackwood stared in disbelief at this man, who was voluntarily giving up a fortune for principle, while the assembled crowd murmured approval for a display of honor that was rare in their experience. "Furthermore," Silas continued, "I request that this court investigate Mr. Blackwood's other foreclosure actions to determine if other families have been victimized by similar schemes." Curtis Blackwood's face went white as he realized the full scope of what was unfolding. His attempt to intimidate a desperate widow had exposed decades of criminal activity that would likely result in criminal charges and financial ruin. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Harrison said coldly, "you will surrender all documents related to Mrs. Harper's mortgage immediately. This court will also be requesting a full audit of your banking practices from the territorial authorities." As the legal proceedings concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Curtis Blackwood made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his schemes. He approached Mary Ellen with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. "You think you've won something here, you little witch? You have no idea what kind of enemy you've made. I'll see you and your bastard children in the poorhouse before I'm done with you." The threat hung in the air for only a moment before Silas stepped between them, his presence radiating the controlled violence of a man who had reached the absolute limit of his patience. "Touch her or her children, and I'll kill you," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying such absolute certainty that even Blackwood stepped backward. "That's not a threat, Curtis. It's a promise." Curtis Blackwood retreated, but his eyes promised that the war was far from over, even if this particular battle had been lost. Outside the courthouse, Mary Ellen stood in the afternoon sunshine, holding the deed to property that was now unquestionably hers, surrounded by well-wishers who had witnessed justice triumph over corruption. But her eyes were only for Silas, the man who had sacrificed his family's legacy for her happiness and security. The question that remained unspoken between them was whether love built on shared adversity could survive the test of changed circumstances. 6 months later, the early spring air carried the scent of new grass and fresh possibilities across the expanded McCrae ranch. Mary Ellen stood in the kitchen of the main house, their house, now watching through the window, as Silas worked with Tommy to gentle a young horse in the corral. The boy had grown taller over the winter, his shoulders broadening with the promise of the man he would become, and his movements carried the confident grace of someone who belonged exactly where he was. On the kitchen table, open to a page marked with pressed wildflowers, lay a new family Bible where Mary Ellen had carefully recorded the most important events of their transformed life. The marriage ceremony that had united her and Silas 3 months earlier was documented in her careful script, along with the legal adoption papers that had given her children the McCrae name and all the security that came with it. "Mrs. McCrae," she whispered to herself, still amazed by the sound of her new name and all it represented. The foreclosure battle had ended Curtis Blackwood's reign of financial terror in the territory. The territorial investigation had uncovered years of fraudulent practices, resulting in criminal charges that would keep him imprisoned for the foreseeable future. Other families who had lost their land to his schemes were being compensated, and the banking practices that had enabled such corruption were being reformed. Mary Ellen's homestead had indeed proven even more valuable than Judge Harrison had estimated. A geological survey had revealed mineral deposits that promised steady income for generations, while the water rights made it some of the most sought-after property in the territory. But more than financial security, the legal victory had given her something precious, the knowledge that her children's future was built on solid ground rather than shifting sand. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, her arms full of sketching supplies and her face bright with artistic excitement. At 9 years old, she had developed a reputation throughout the territory for her ability to capture not just physical likenesses, but the essential character of her subjects. The walls of the ranch house were decorated with her work drawings that transformed everyday moments into treasured memories. "Mama, look what I finished," Sarah said, spreading her latest creation across the table beside the family Bible. The drawing showed the ranch house as it was now not, the cold, silent monument to grief it had been when they first arrived, but a home filled with life and warmth and love. Smoke rose from the chimney. Children played in the yard, and through the windows, viewers could glimpse the domestic happiness that radiated from within. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Mary Ellen said, studying the careful details that revealed how completely Sarah understood the transformation that had taken place. "You've captured something special here." Little Ben burst through the kitchen door with the boundless energy of a 6-year-old who had been officially adopted by the man he already called Papa without reservation. His vocabulary had expanded dramatically under Silas's patient tutelage, and his confidence had blossomed in the security of a stable home. "Mama, Papa says I can help drive the cattle to the upper pasture next week." Ben's announcement carried the pride of someone who had been entrusted with important responsibilities. "He says I'm old enough to have my own horse." Mary Ellen exchanged amused glances with Sarah, both of them understanding that Silas was as transformed by fatherhood as the children were by having a father. The man who had locked his heart away after losing his first family had discovered that love multiplied rather than diminished when shared. As evening approached, the family gathered around the dinner table that had once known only silence and solitude. Tommy shared news of his progress with reading and mathematics, skills that would serve him well when he inherited responsibility for ranch operations. Sarah entertained them all with stories inspired by her drawings, weaving elaborate tales about the characters and creatures that populated her artistic imagination. Little Ben regaled them with detailed accounts of his adventures helping with ranch work, his narratives growing more elaborate with each telling. Silas listened to each child with the focused attention of a man who understood that these moments were precious beyond any material wealth. His transformation from grieving widower to devoted husband and father had been gradual but complete, like ice melting under the persistent warmth of spring sunshine. After the children were settled for the night, Mary Ellen and Silas walked hand in hand through the ranch that had become their shared legacy. The evening star appeared in the darkening sky, a pinpoint of light that reminded them both of the night when their lives had begun to intertwine. "Do you ever regret it?" Mary Ellen asked quietly. "Giving up your family's claim to my land?" Silas stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands framing her face with the tenderness of a man who had learned to cherish what he had rather than mourn what he had lost. "How can I regret the decision that brought me the greatest happiness of my life?" His voice carried the deep contentment of someone who had found his true purpose. "Land is just dirt and grass, Mary Ellen. Family is everything." They stood together in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the evidence of their shared success: prosperous fields, healthy livestock, and the warm glow of lamplight from the house where their children slept safely. The desperate woman who had once stood barefoot at the ranch gates, pleading for work, had become the heart of an empire built on love rather than conquest. In the distance, they could hear the sound of cattle settling for the night, the whisper of wind through new grass, and the promise of tomorrow carried on the evening air. They had built something together that would last for generations, not just a successful ranch operation, but a family legacy based on the understanding that true wealth was measured in love shared, children raised with care, and the quiet satisfaction of work done well. The circle was complete. The desperate plea for work had become a foundation for love, and two broken hearts had healed each other through the simple but profound act of choosing hope over fear, trust over suspicion, and love over pride.